evening. Lately, many people have found themselves spending a little more time in and around the house and have taken advantage of it by learning and developing new skills. I would like to focus on the kitchen. Tonight, I would like to explain to you how to prepare a national cabinet. Now, many of you may be familiar with the classic coag cake. This dates back to 1992. Even though one of its principal creators was more famous for his roasts, it proved remarkably enduring and has adapted to certain changes in ingredients. Principal among them is a large helping of Prime Minister and then equal parts of Premier or Chief Grade Ministers. An essential part of the preparation, of course, was that at least 7 ninths of them had to be imported from different regions. It was a popular cake for a time, particularly amongst those interested in competition-level pie growing and slicing. However, over time, some small tweaks and changes were made to its basic nature, leading to some criticism that had become over-elaborate and more a canvas to allow adornments, showmanship, prioritising some elements at the expense of others, producing ever more complicated recipes that became harder to follow and less appealing to the general public. Other downsides came from the fact that it was complicated to prepare. You could really only make it when the head chef was in the mood, and it came to be made only a couple of times a year. Something less complicated and easier and faster to prepare was thought to be necessary. Accordingly, the greatest chefs in the nation gathered on Friday, 13th of March, and, after making one last coag, for old time's sake, ended up by producing a new and exciting variation on the classic cabinet. Now, the classic cabinet cake has been around for a while. There are even passing references to it from the 16th century. But this was not quite the same thing as we know now. Originally, the principal ingredient was royalty. It was a heady mix, but this tended to overawe or suppress the lesser contents. The modern cabinet cake was developed after it was discovered that, in fact, it held together quite well. Indeed, some thought had greater solidarity if the royalty was omitted or relegated to a more decorative part. How this discovery was made is a little unclear, but it seems to have occurred about 1717 or so. One of the hallowed myths is that it arose by accident when it was being prepared by a German who couldn't read the recipe and who refused to ask his son to translate it for him because they'd had a bit of a falling out. Of course, it may have been that there just wasn't enough royalty to go around, and Hanoverian hodgepodge may well have been thought more important and more preferable than wasting or mixing it with the more unsavoury cabinet elements. As it turned out, this low royalty or royalty-free cabinet was preferable to changing English tastes. It's proven most successful. The recipe has been exported around the world. It's something of a staple in government circles in Australia. So what makes a national cabinet different from a cabinet? In a classic or conventional cabinet, of course, we look to see that all the ingredients are locally sourced and indeed come from the same parliamentary terroir. Conventionally, this assists in binding them together, and when sufficiently battered, the collective responsibility is baked in nicely so that the ingredients all hang together. One of the principal effects of this, and really what you're looking for in a classic cabinet, in my view, is a nice, glossy, gorgeously rich, almost satin-like exterior suggestive of impenetrable secrecy, concealing the lush, rich, indulgent goodness inside. Indeed, the conventional understanding is that the cabinet would fail to rise or would collapse if the shell or crust were pierced. Helpfully, the CWA has now updated the Classic Cabinet Handbook. In Section 8, it now discusses how to prepare or manufacture a national cabinet. While the recipe doesn't expressly state it, prior experience suggests that an essential first step in making a national cabinet is a long preheating of the environment. The first national cabinet, of course, was made after a raging summer wood fire, but I don't recommend trying this at home. A national cabinet's principal ingredients are, like the coag, a chair of Prime Minister and a brace of Premier and Chief Grade Ministers from different regions. However, the national cabinet mixes this up a little. Early sampling suggests it's been more appealing than the coag, and indeed in May this year it was said that the coag would never be made again. One of the differences from coag, according to the recipe, is the addition of a liberal serve of collective responsibility a la Westminster to create a good firm solidarity net. Now, one of the important things when adding these ingredients is to get the proportions right. You don't want to slip. A good national cabinet, according to the recipe, is not supposed to overwhelm the sovereign taste inherent in each of its major ingredients. Each of these is supposed to maintain its distinctive state flavour. Helpfully, the recipe provides that the precise structure, shape and operation of a national cabinet is not fixed. You can vary the mould as required. And unlike the COAG, a national cabinet is much easier to put together. All that's really required is a few calls, a few head chefs and citric acid to share. It has to be said that some people are critical of this recipe. It has been suggested that the national cabinet is akin to a simplified, slimmer and rebranded COAG, rather than a variation of the classic cabinet. They've suggested that the taking of its ingredients from different regions or terroirs means that collected together, no one region is responsible. And of course, for the classic cabinet, it is that collective quality that has conventionally been thought to be the success of its secrets. If that is so, they ask, how can it really have the same je ne sais quoi as a classic cabinet? Indeed, some people go so far as to suggest other improvements to the national cabinet, such as the addition of a quantity of quality FOI sauce. Indeed, the South Australian sous chef Rex Patrick has suggested that the national cabinet shouldn't really be classed as a cabinet at all. He has called for this recipe to be taken to the Administrative Appellation Tribunal to determine whether it really is entitled to the trademark protection bestowed on cabinets. We'll wait the outcome, but in the meantime, bon appetit.